Beethoven's Symphony Number 2 from the year of 1802. This, for me, is the work in which Beethoven transitions from the world of the First Symphony, where he is the bright, devoted student of his teacher, Joseph Haydn, offering us a perfect little symphony in the late classical Viennese style, to a work which really, written again just a couple of years later, really heralds the beginning of a kind of early romanticism in European music in the 19th century. Still, in many ways, a conventional symphony in D major, which Haydn or Mozart would certainly have stylistically recognized, but already a new level of lyricism, a broader palette through which Beethoven is now working. As the Symphony Number 1 is very much a symphony in the style of Joseph Haydn, you could perhaps mistake it for one of those glorious symphonies that Haydn wrote late in his career for the city of London and its great burgeoning musical scene, symphonies like the Surprise Symphony or the Clock Symphony. With the Second Symphony, I think Beethoven is not so secretly paying homage to the world of that composer with whom he always wanted to study, but never got the chance, the divine Mozart. For this Second Symphony is shot through with this Mozartian lyricism that not only comes from that perhaps greatest of all composers, along with Beethoven, but also the world of late classical Italian opera, which of course Mozart himself participated in works like The Marriage of Figaro and Così fan tutte, but again, a style of music which we now forget here in the early 21st century, a style of music that was everywhere in Europe. Composers whose names today are sadly almost completely forgotten, like Muzio Clementi and Domenico Cimarosa, these composers whose works, both operatic and concert works, piano music, chamber music, were played everywhere in Europe, were great musical favorites in Vienna, Beethoven's adopted hometown. And that Italian spirit in music and in the arts in general, certainly in painting as well, was still really seen as the source from which you gathered your own tools as an artist, as a composer. You feel that lyricism at the very, very beginning of the slow introduction of the first movement, which of course with Beethoven is another perfect essay in what we call sonata allegro form, in which you present and then develop and then recapitulate thematic material. This slow introduction could almost be from an overture to an early Rossini opera, Rossini also being another great early romantic opera composer who was immensely popular in Vienna in Beethoven's day. Again, there's this sweet, very Italianate Mozartian lyricism that is just everywhere from the very beginning. You may remember at the beginning of the First Symphony, Beethoven was being in his bad boy mode by giving us a slow introduction in which we harmonically have no idea where he's going until a few bars into the piece. But here, we are absolutely in this comfortable Mozartian world of D major. The main body of the first movement is another, again, perfect essay in sonata form. The thematic material almost sounds like it's from a Beethoven string quartet. I'm always, when I conduct this piece and listen to it, I'm always reminded of, for example, the Beethoven Opus 59 string quartets. The music has a very chamber music-like character. In the development section, try to notice as to how he breaks these themes into little parts and then throws them around the orchestra in this incredibly rigorously impressive style of symphonic development, and the way one section of the orchestra, for example the high woodwinds, will be in conversation with another group of instrumentalists at the very other end of the orchestra, like the cellos and the basses. And it's amazing how Beethoven is already, just in his second symphony, a complete master of orchestration. The second movement, the slow movement, is just the most beautiful the most beautiful song. It's marked larghetto, which is slightly slow. Again, a name in Italian which just kind of itself invokes a kind of gentleness. It's this beautiful, beautiful song with contrasting thematic episodes that never ceases to soothe a troubled soul. The third movement, again, by this point we have left the world of the stately minuet in three-quarter time. We're now, as with the first symphony, we have another even gutsier Beethoven scherzo. But unlike that Haydn-esque kind of, gallant style of the scherzo of the first symphony, here is something else again, a new development. There is a new, again, sophistication in its thematic development, in its orchestration that Beethoven, again, I think gets from the world of Mozart and Italian opera. The finale is Beethoven at his most rambunctious, this somersault of a main theme that never ceases to delight. Again, brought together in this perfect sonata form with, it must be said, the beginning of this Beethovenian tradition of the coda. Coda is an Italian word for tail, and it's that part of a symphonic movement that's the very, very end, where the composer has already reprised the thematic material and now wants to wrap it up with a bow. And Beethoven here begins this style in which you never quite know where he's going. You think he's going to wrap things up, and then he takes yet another turn. There are these series of fermatas, where a fermata meaning a hold, where the music just stops and then keeps going. And you, again, like the beginning of the very first movement of the first symphony, Beethoven keeps us in suspense, which was something that, as you won't be surprised to hear, really, really frustrated the very conservative music critics of the time. The last thing one absolutely has to know about this Symphony No. 2 of Beethoven was that it was written at a time when Beethoven knew unquestionably that he was going deaf. It's the work that is always associated with his consciousness of his encroaching deafness. Imagine the thought of the world's greatest composer going deaf. It's almost unbearable. It's nothing short of a miracle that Beethoven didn't take his own life in despair. Of course, unlike the most of us, Beethoven could hear the music in his head, so he still had his glorious career as a composer ahead of him. But this was the time, 1801, 1802, when he knew. The doctors tried to humor him about it, his friends tried to distract him, but he knew he was going deaf. So just think about how this symphony, again, a very Mozartian idea. If you think how Mozart wrote his Paris Symphony just exactly at the time when his mother died, that Beethoven, at this time of profound personal despair, a struggle that really won't be resolved until the final C major chords of the Symphony No. 5, despite that, is able to overcome that and give us this symphony suffused with light. Beethoven's Second Symphony, a glorious performance by the great conductor Daniel Barenboim with the musicians who comprise his great passionate project over the course of his career, the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. These amazingly dedicated young musicians from Israel and all of the Arab world making glorious music together.